Hello, everybody. I'm Ramez Naam. Many of you know me, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with my friends Andrew McAfee and Erik Brynjolfsson. And we were just talking backstage. It was 3.5 years ago we met on this stage.
We met.
Yeah,
the friendship was initiated here at Town Hall in Seattle. It's fantastic to be back. I'm serious about that.
Hopefully you guys make some friends tonight too.
Yeah.
And it was because we were talking about your previous book, The Second Machine Age. So what's happened in the 3.5 years since The Second Machine Age?
Nothing much.
Yeah, business as usual. Well, I mean, the main thing that happened, and it's a little bit embarrassing, is that tech progress continues to surprise the two of us, even after we wrote a book about surprisingly fast tech progress. Yeah. Just weird things keep happening. And Erik and I kind of looked at each other at one point and said, hey, this continues to be extremely interesting. We continue to be extremely fascinated by this, and there's just more and more story to tell. So we went back out and talked to our favorite alpha geeks and wrote another book.
And the other half of it is, yeah, tech is happening faster, especially in the areas of machine learning, but also the rise of these platforms and the core and crowd is a new thing we didn't really talk about before in the other book. But the other thing that is the disappointing half of it is that our organizations, our institutions are not keeping up. If anything, that's turned out even worse than we would have anticipated 3.5 years ago. So there's this mismatch, and we were hoping to try to do something, not to slow down the technology, but to speed up our adaptation to it.
Right, so Second Machine Age was really a book about the impact on society of these changes, and this is a book about how organizations can try to keep up with what's happening. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a nice way to think about it.
Exactly.
So you have these 3 words in the title: machine, platform, crowd. Why don't we take it from the bottom? Like, can you walk through like crowd, platform, machine, what these all mean, why you're talking about them?
Now you're really throwing us off here.
I said, Andy was joshing me that I didn't want any prep. We're just going to get up here on stage. So I said I'd try to throw in some harder ones to try to confuse them a little bit.
We weren't expecting a crazy curveball like that. Like, we're very used to going machine, platform, crowd. We're deer in headlights with this. The way we're framing the book is in terms of 3 rebalancings or pretty deep rethinkings that need to happen within organizations. And with crowd, we counterpose the crowd, which is literally these hundreds of millions of random weirdos out there on the internet, with the core, with what organizations think they're really, really good at. And we kept on coming across these crazy examples of what organizations thought they were really, really good at. The instant you give them an honest head-to-head comparison or competition between what their core can come up with versus what the crowd can come up with, the crowd eats their lunch. The crowd just mops the floor with what the best people of the core can come up with. And so we found all these fascinating examples of that, and it's worth diving into and figuring out how and why is the crowd so powerful.
Can you give us an example? What's a scenario where the crowd did better than the core of a company?
Well, here's a good one that just got launched today. I was just reading as I was coming over here, just before I was coming over here, there's an organization called Kaggle. Anybody familiar with Kaggle? So this is a group, an organization that's brought together 1 million data scientists. And the US government has just asked them to run a contest to figure out better ways to speed up airport screening, to identify things more efficiently and speed the process. They have a $1.5 million prize.
Can anyone here think of a more important thing to
do? Exactly. And the reason that they went to Kaggle is that, as Andy was saying, there's some pretty smart people working in Homeland Security, people who they could hire from Harvard or MIT or UW or wherever, but instead of just picking a few core people to work on this, they want to tap into that 1 million plus data scientists. And as Andy was saying, when they do that, they get answers just out of left field. One of the reasons that the crowd works so well is not just that there's a bunch of people, but more importantly, that there's a lot of diversity of people. Any organization, no matter how good it is, most of the smart people work outside of that organization. Furthermore, in the organization, people tend to get groupthink. They sort of start thinking the same ways. They hire people similar to them. But what makes these contests successful is that there's some very new approaches, techniques, algorithms that people are doing in Ireland or Bangalore or Norway or wherever that the people in the core hadn't been familiar with. And those can sometimes make a 10 or 20 or 50% improvement in the performance, and sometimes even a few 100% improvement.
One of the weirdest examples we came across that made it into the book, you know who our buddy Kareem Lakhani is at Harvard Business School? He's one of our colleagues, does great research about how to tap into the crowd.
He's at Harvard, we're at MIT, but we claim him because he got his PhD at MIT.
Yeah, so he got brought up proper is what I'm trying to say. So Kareem worked with the National Institutes of Health to try to see if they could improve over the baseline NIH algorithm for sequencing human white blood cells, which have really weird genomes. So you got to do some clever work on it. The baseline algorithm from the NIH could do this work in about 4 hours with about 70% accuracy. Is that good? Is that bad? National Institutes of Health. Yeah, I mean, okay, that's the National Institutes of Health. You'd think that's kind of a good baseline to work from. There's a researcher at Harvard Medical School, also kind of the core of the medical establishment, who got it down from 4 hours to 1 hour and got it up to about 75% accuracy. Okay, that's better. Then Kareem worked with Topcoder in this case, another crowdsourced tough problem site, and threw this problem open to all the random weirdos out there on the internet. And the best solutions that came from the random weirdos of the internet did the work in 10 seconds and did it at about 80% accuracy, which they thought was close to the theoretical maximum here. And when they went and interviewed the people who submitted those solutions, there was not one person with life sciences experience among them. Most of them were students. They were all from fields very, very far away. So the fancy word for some of the secret sauce here is marginality. If your expertise is marginal or kind of far away from the apparent domain of the problem, chances of solving actually go up. You know Eric Raymond's law, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. There's a lot of eyeballs out there.
It's amazing. 4 hours to 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Kareem wrote this paper up, and Eric and I read it, and I called him up immediately. I said, he's a friend of mine, so I said, dude, is this the craziest thing you've ever seen? And he said, it's about average. I said, come on. He said, if I run a competition, a fair crowd competition, and I don't see this magnitude of improvement from the crowd, I think I've done my work incorrectly.
So what stops more and more companies from actually taking advantage of this ability to tap into the crowd?
They haven't read the book yet. But, but I'm only half joking. It honestly is, I mean, the technology is there. This is a cultural change. This is a mindset change. It was something that you just couldn't do. You physically couldn't do this a decade or two ago. We now, for the first time, have the majority of the world's population, the majority of the world's brains connected in a global internet and able to share information like this more or less instantaneously. That hasn't always been true in history. That's never been true before. And not only can they tap into that data, more importantly, they can add to that data. So people are just now discovering new, clever ways to tap into the crowd. These contests are only one way. Wikipedia is another way.
You have a great story about Newpedia that preceded Wikipedia and how it changed.
Yeah, well, that's a good example. So the Newpedia was kind of despite the name, kind of the old thinking of how you make an encyclopedia. You have some experts, and you go through this 7-step process where you vet it and blah, blah, blah. They got a bunch. Jimmy Wales, the guy who did start Wikipedia, first started Newpedia. They got a few $100,000 worth of funding. They worked on it for a year. At the end of the year, I think they had, like 12 articles done, something like that.
So this is a 1,000% true story. How many of you have heard of Newpedia?
There you go.
This was the direct predecessor, founded by the exact same people as Wikipedia. They wanted to make sure only experts could edit articles. They had a 7-step process that everyone had to go through, and the world said, yeah, no, thank you.
But then, they sort of as this little skunkworks thing, some people say, there's this new, type of software, wikis. You could just kind of throw stuff up real quickly. Why don't we just let people just kind of play around with that? And so they let anybody could just sort of play around with it. And you know the rest of the story. People started writing articles like crazy. Soon they had 1,000 articles. Soon they had 10,000 articles. And then Jimmy Wales' company said, wait a minute, what are we doing with this Newpedia thing? We got to do the Wikipedia option. And now it's become, the resource. So that's another way that you're able to tap into a crowd. But it's a mindset change to understand that you can tap into this. And one of the things we want to see more and more is people being creative about other ways to tap into the crowd. Google, the power of Google, when you think about it, is really tapping into the crowd. Yeah, they've got some super smart engineers in Mountain View and elsewhere, but how do they rank the pages? There's something called PageRank, and it's based on the link structure. And where those links come from, everybody in the crowd decides what pages to link to. And when you link to a page, when you write a web page and you link to others, you are voting. And so basically what Google is doing is taking the collective wisdom of the crowd, all the votes that different pages get, and the ones with more votes get up to the top of the search rankings. So they are leveraging our collective thinking.
Mez, your question is one that Erik and I grappled with a lot in the book. Why is it so hard for successful, incumbent, established, well-managed companies to see these possibilities? And like Erik says, the idea of crowdsourcing your toughest problems went from actually inconceivable, this is extraordinarily hard to do 20 years ago, to kind of cognitively inconceivable, even though the technology environment changes really quickly. So the mantra that I've adopted as we wrote this book was that tech progress rewrites the business playbook, and a lot of even very good companies get stuck in the old version of the playbook.
So we talk about collective intelligence, and these are awesome examples, but we've seen some failures recently, right? We've seen harassment and hate on Twitter. We've seen fake news on Facebook.
Yes.
Maybe the filter bubble, collective intelligence seeming to go down rat holes. Does that make you rethink your thesis at all?
Well, I think this is a powerful tool, and any powerful tool can be used for good or evil. And yeah, let's compare. Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, they all harness the crowd in different ways. They have slightly different structures. And Wikipedia, even the first time, they didn't get the fine-tune it quite right. Wikipedia tends to have a lot less fake news. And actually, we were talking to Jimmy Wales about this, and he thinks, I'm convinced, that a lot of it has to do with the fine structure of how you set it up. And that the way Facebook was set up, it's very prone to these filter bubbles. You share stuff with your friends, and your friends aren't inclined to fact-check it. At Wikipedia, there are these editors, you don't know who they are, and they take it upon themselves to fact-check it. They're not your buddies. They're not there to, say, rah-rah, more of the, go Obama, go Trump, whatever. They have a very different perspective. And depending on how you set it up, you get different outcomes. One of the things that we're collectively doing is experimenting with different ways of structuring it. And sometimes we mess up. And you talk to Mark Zuckerberg, and I think he'd be among the first to say, they messed up big time in 2016. At first, they thought, hey, it's not our responsibility. They say, we're like selling a pencil, and if someone writes bad words with a pencil, that's not our responsibility. And they were sticking to that line for a while, and now they've backed off to say, you know what? No, that's not right at all. That's not the right model.
One thing that I think we've learned in 2016 and 2017 is that free speech is a bummer. Right? Because we are actually giving, there's the old great quote from the journalist A.J. Liebling. He said, freedom of the press is limited to those who own one. Okay, hey everybody, we got a printing press now. And so do the Nazis and the racists and the anti-Semites and the trollers and the haters, and that echo chamber can make these environments filthy, filthy places. So I have not walked away from my devotion to free speech, but I'm going to segue and talk about another chunk of our book now. We kind of think that a big part of the solution to this weakness of the crowd are actually machines. And what I mean by that are machine learning algorithms that can recognize vitriolic speech, terrorist speech, stuff like that, do that very sophisticated pattern matching and yank it down, in addition to these architectural changes that Erik talked about, so that you can reconfigure things so that the echo chamber doesn't echo quite as loud.
But at the end of the day, I think more and more the limiting thing, and one of the things we stress in the book, is figuring out our institutions, and the organizational side of it is where I think there's been a bigger and bigger gap. And it's great that the technologists are working on the machine algorithms and the ways to tap into the crowd, but the biggest bottleneck and the biggest gap is figuring out how to use them more effectively, the economic principles underlying, the organizational principles underlying. And that's a big part of why we wrote the book, was to try to lay out that this is not just random chaos out there or the luck of the draw. There are some underlying principles that can work.
This is actually where I disagree with Erik a little bit. I'm a bigger fan of using the machines instead of the institutions on this one. Everything that you and I see on Facebook and a lot of these other platforms has been teed up for us by a machine learning algorithm. Great. Tweak those to damp the stupidity and the hatred and the echoing.
So you both have hope that this filter bubble can get better, and you would use machines to assess truthiness, and you would change the incentives or the structure of Facebook to change.
Well, I think we do both.
Yeah.
Maybe we put the emphasis differently. And we don't have faith. I wouldn't quite use that word.
Hope?
Yeah.
Optimism.
I think that there's the potential for it, but it's very much going to depend on our choices, and it's certainly not going to be automatic. And the last thing I'd want to do is just sit back and say, hey, don't worry, it's all going to work out. That would be totally the wrong attitude.
Totally.
So since we're talking about Facebook, let's dive into what it is, which is it's a platform. So you talk about a change from businesses selling products to businesses creating platforms that soak up a lot of that value. What's happening there?
Well, I would soak up, I create a lot of that value.
Great.
So 5 of the 5 most valuable companies in the world are basically platform companies. 2 of them here in Seattle, Microsoft and Amazon, but also Facebook, Google Alphabet, and Apple. And what they have in common is not that they create some great products, but more importantly, that they enable an ecosystem. They create a platform for other people to contribute to that. And so whether it's Apple's apps that people are contributing, or in other ways, and these platforms scale as more and more people participate in them. They have network effects, or even more subtly, we get into the book, two-sided network effects. You're all familiar with the basic network effect, which is like the value of a telephone goes up if other people own the telephone. If no one else has a telephone, it's not very valuable, or a fax machine or whatever. So that's a network effect, that more people using the same product is more valuable. A two-sided network is a little more subtle, but it's when people are using a other side of the network, a complement. For instance, Uber is another kind of a platform that took off very quickly. What they were able to do is create one app for users, and there's actually a different app that the drivers use. And as a user, I don't really care if lots of other users are using it. I want more drivers to be on it. And what the drivers care about is not having lots of drivers. They want to have people on the other side. And the platform is able to connect these two sides in different ways. Facebook is connecting advertisers and the users. And each of these, and Apple is actually a multi-sided network where you've got the different kinds of apps, the users, Apple's on the iPhones, and the more people that participate in any one of those sides, the more valuable it is to the other parts of it. So this concept of these multi-sided networks is driven in part by the digitization that we referred to earlier, these underlying technologies. It's also driven by some new economics that people really didn't understand very well. One of our colleagues, Jean Parole, got a Nobel Prize a few years ago for really working.
He never shuts up about it either. It's really annoying.
Actually, Jean is like one of the most modest.
He's one of the nicest low-key guys in the world.
Strike on the record.
Despite being French.
Oh, wow.
No,
we went there.
And he's a very sweet guy. And he worked this out, and there's some beautiful, elegant math. Some of our other colleagues, like Marshall Van Alstyne, helped to contribute to it. And what we try and do in the book is say, look, these platforms aren't just accidents that just pop up. That if you understand the economics, you can see sometimes it makes sense to give stuff away for free, and then you make money on the other side of the network. It's not always a good idea to give stuff away for free. You should just do it willy-nilly. But if you understand the platform economics, you can see when it is a profitable strategy.
And Erik just did a really nice job of walking through those economics. My favorite part when we were writing the section on platforms was highlighting how no less an authority on all things digital than Steve Jobs very nearly blew this.
Right. I love this story.
This is an actual true story. When Jobs introduced the iPhone.
All our stories are true stories.
A decent fraction of our stories are true stories. So the iPhone came out just about a little more than 10 years ago, January of 2007. And when it was introduced, some of us are probably old enough to remember this, all of the apps that were available for the iPhone were developed by Apple. And that was not an accident. That was an adamant, deliberate strategy by Steve Jobs. Jobs was a control freak, and he didn't want random, crashy, buggy, virusy kinds of things mucking up his beautiful iPhone. He had colleagues on the board, he had executives inside the company who tried to persuade him of some of the economics that Erik just talked about and said, look, open this platform up and you're going to unleash a whole lot of energy. And Jobs was like, nope. And it took about a year and a half of convincing for him to do it. Apple finally opened up the iPhone store, it was called iTunes back then, opened up iTunes to outside developers of the iPhone in July of 2008. And just like with Wikipedia, they came back a half hour later and there were 6,000 articles. They came back a day later and there were 400 amazing apps available for the iPhone. And it's one of the few times that I think Jobs ever came anywhere near close to admitting that he'd been anything less than faultless about something.
So you're saying Steve Jobs did not want me to have Angry Birds?
No, not unless his people came up with Angry Birds.
He learned.
This is true.
Doesn't seem like a very Apple product, Angry Birds.
Yeah.
So when you look at these platforms, it seems that there's, in most of them, because of the network effects, there's a winner-takes-all dynamic, or winner leaves for one or two or three winners totally. Does that concern you as far as monopolizing power or lack of innovation or stagnation?
The guideline that I try to follow is that all great concentrations of power demand vigilance, and we need to be mindful of them and watch out for them and try to make sure that they're not abusing that power or doing things that we don't like, right? To me, that's different than saying that all great concentrations of power need to be broken up. And here's a flip analogy. America is a great concentration of power. I am not about to commit treason here on this stage. I am not advocating that we break up the United States government. So in the same way, I will worry a lot more about the power that these platform companies have. And these are really powerful companies, and we need to be vigilant. I'll worry more about them when I get clear evidence that either innovation is being squelched or that we consumers are being harmed.
And Andy just hit on the two key tests for good antitrust. I mean, when a competitor becomes very, very powerful, its competitors get angry and they say, hey, we've got to stop these guys. We at Walmart are having trouble competing with Amazon or whatever. And
Boo-hoo-hoo
it's
for
understandable
Walmart,
that
right?
they would say that and marshal as much anger in that direction. But the regulators and the rest of us, we shouldn't be worrying about the competitors. We should be worrying about the consumers or about the innovation. And on both those fronts, so far, these companies are pushing prices down, even to the point of free for a lot of them. And I don't see like a lack of innovation in the app economy or social media. It looks like it's still going pretty strong, stronger than in these other places. Now, if that changes,
yeah.
I'm totally with Andy. You know, we need to be vigilant. And I guess when Amazon bought Whole Foods, they got about 4% of the grocery market. You know, if that gets to be 60% and they start raising prices, then I would change the story. But the other thing that gives me some, confidence and maybe willingness to sit back a little bit is another economist. I love quoting economists, Joseph Schumpeter. So he was a great Austrian economist, and he came up with this concept of creative destruction. And the way he described a capitalist, successful economy working was, yes, you get monopolies, but then another monopoly overtakes it, and another monopoly overtakes it. So you get companies that become dominant for a while, but if they don't keep innovating, someone else can innovate it. So there was once VisiCalc, and then Lotus, and then Excel, and and each of them, they got overtaken. They had big, 70% market shares for a while, and eventually, Windows just became more or less irrelevant as the iPhone and other tools became more pertinent. So that's what I see a lot more of happening in this tech economy. Is absolutely you get these monopolies, but as long as they're temporary and they're subject to challenge,
right.
then
Exactly.
it's less of a concern.
And one of the classic things that a monopolist does that we need to watch out for is price gouge. Kind of hard for Google and Facebook to price gouge us when they give it away for free.
That's a pretty low price.
I think it doesn't hurt, right? It doesn't feel like I'm being gouged.
Yeah. So you have some advice or some analysis of what leads to a company being successful in building a platform. So if there's entrepreneurs here who want to get into a new space, let's say, that isn't monopolized already, what would you tell them to do to try to establish themselves successfully?
Again, there's a book.
Step one.
But what we try to do in the middle section of the book is go through the economics that Erik just went through a second ago in a bit more detail to talk about why two-sided or n-sided markets work, why you would drop prices for one side versus the other, which side you would pick, and kind of do all that. At the same time, so I think the economics are at the core of all these successful platform companies that we learned about and that we think are really, really cool. At the same time, we found a couple other things they seem to do really well. One of them is focus obsessively on the user interface and the user experience, which is hard to do on a very small amount of real estate. You're trying to cram in a lot of functionality. So all the platform companies that we talk to work like crazy on getting that stuff right. And they A/B test, and they've got really smart people on it. And then the other thing they do is they just draw in data geeks from economics and operations research and yield management and stuff like that, and they cram a whole lot of math and algorithms and matching inside the ecosystem that they build.
Yeah, And what they do, if they do it right, they get a virtuous cycle going, or I guess the term of art these days is flywheel going, where you get a few more users on one side, and then you get more on the other side, and it becomes a positive feedback loop. But getting that ignited, getting that started can be very difficult. So if you can find a way that can work with very small numbers of users, or just a lead user, then you can ignite that virtuous cycle. And if it gets going, it can take off very rapidly, and it becomes, like you said, often a winner-take-all market or winner-take-most market. Venture capitalists love that, because if you can be out in front and they're willing to invest to try to get you into that lead. But you also got to be careful, because the same thing can unravel. If you start getting into a vicious cycle where it goes the opposite way, it can all come undone pretty quickly too.
We got a great example of exactly how to do this just 2 days ago. We had a book event in San Francisco. We invited some of our alpha geeks to come talk with us on stage. And one of them is Patrick Collison, co-founder of Stripe. Stripe is a payments company founded by these two Irish kids. And I'm using the word correctly. Patrick and John Collison were 21 and 19 years old, respectively, when they founded this company to take on the established payments industry around the world.
Take on the banking industry.
Well, what the heck were you thinking? But they're really very, very smart, thoughtful, great entrepreneurs. And Patrick said, look, we realized that if we could build a payments platform and more merchants would show up, and then more kinds of payment would show up, and then we'd have different countries, and we could get this virtuous cycle going. But at the start, it had to do something for a customer that we were interested in.
Even just one.
And he said, the one thing we could do for an online merchant from the get-go was accept a credit card. Just help them process those kinds of payments. And that was enough of a toehold, and they did other clever things, and they got the virtuous cycle going.
Okay, and maybe Uber, if they're not lucky enough, might be at the start of a vicious cycle.
Well, that's that. At Uber, there's a couple lessons there. Obviously, their culture has some serious problems, but the fact that they had such powerful two-sided network effects in this platform, I think that sustained them through a less than optimal culture. But it's not unstoppable. You could easily see it coming out. And what we've seen the past couple of months is that their market share has started turning downward and Lyft going up. So you could be seeing something really ugly if it gets to a certain point.
Yeah. Running a dysfunctional kind of ugly corporate culture is a terrible idea in this day and age and all previous ones.
Excellent. Even if you've got a strong platform. We can all applaud to that one.
We can all get behind that idea.
So let's go to machine. I saved this for last. Your previous book was The Second Machine Age. You talked about AI and machine learning and amazing feats. What's happened just in that sector in the last 3.5 years? What's gotten better?
Well, the biggest thing, and by the way, we all of our books so far, this is the third book we've written, they all have the word machine in it. So we really are obsessing about this. Theme. And we pay close attention. And the biggest thing has just been the amazing progress in machine learning. We touched on it in the last book, but certainly us too, but even the geeks working in machine learning didn't expect it to advance as rapidly as it has. And we sometimes call this the second wave of the second machine age, in that a lot of the stuff in the last book was about how technology we could teach machines how to do things. Now machines are learning on their own, and they've gotten to the point where they're crossing some real significant thresholds. For instance, vision systems that learn on their own how to recognize faces or cancer cells or other objects are now getting to the point where they are not just as good, but even better than human vision at recognizing those same things. Sound systems or voice recognition systems are beginning to recognize speech at that point. The error rate on Google Home went from 8.5% to 4.9%, not in the past 10 years, but in the past 10 months. And that's because of these deep neural net systems. It's a certain branch of machine learning where you feed it lots of examples and it learns. And the people working in the field say that we're just in early days. This is going to improve more and more. And this technique of deep neural nets, supervised learning, they can apply it to lots of other areas that previously hadn't been applied to before. So we think that there are some huge impacts that are happening on business, on the economy, on the workforce as you cross that threshold. I mean, think about it. If something goes from being worse than human to better than human, then that's not just a difference in degree, that's a difference in kind. If you are an entrepreneur or a manager, you're going to pick, whatever tool, whatever resource, whatever person is best for that job. And if it goes from being a human to a machine, that's going to change the calculus in lots and lots of businesses or across America and across the world.
I find it hard to overstate how big a deal this is. We are no longer limited by our own knowledge. We can build machines that do better than us, that exceed our own knowledge. And that sounds like some kind of trippy sci-fi thing. It's already happened a couple times. A lot of us are probably aware that the world's best player of the Asian strategy game Go is now a piece of technology, right? We kind of knew that. That piece of technology is not just playing Go better than the best human players, it's playing differently than the best human players. It made moves in some of these very high-level matches that were inexplicable at the time. Nobody commenting or watching the match would know why the machine made that move, because it violated about 3,000 years of accumulated human knowledge about how to play this game. Those moves turned out to be the right ones. How do we know? The machine won the game. And the current Chinese champion of Go, who's a phenomenally talented player, went on their equivalent of Twitter a little while back, and he said, after he had played AlphaGo, he said, "I don't think a single human has touched the edge of the truth of the game of Go. We played this game, we invented this game, we played it for 3,000 years, we got up to this level." And it kind of reminds me of the algorithm, like of the NIH. How good is this? How much headroom is on top of this? And AlphaGo seems to be saying, gang, there's a lot of headroom on top of this. And so I think about these other incredibly complicated, incredibly rich domains where we'd like to be smart, whether that's material science or investing or genetics. And we're not the only game in town. We have a colleague that can help us. And I think in a lot of domains, our knowledge is here. And we're going to see a lot of headroom opening up. I'm really excited about that.
So just to riff off what you're saying that AI, machine learning, could be the best scientist at designing new materials. It could be the best doctor at diagnosing a disease from medical imagery. Yeah. It could be the best engineer for designing a new airplane part.
I want to be clear. Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and already is in a lot of those. So there have been published papers in Nature. Our friend Sebastian Thun published one where a machine learning algorithm did a better job diagnosing cancer. We were talking to our friend Carl Bass, used to be the CEO of Autodesk, and he was showing these trippy objects that had been designed by machines. There's a heat exchanger, and it looked really beautiful, kind of psychedelic. It had some delicate curves to it. He said no human would have designed a heat exchanger.
Unless they were really high, I think is what Carl actually said.
But then it wouldn't have worked.
Right, and then it would not exchange heat.
One completely exceeded anything that any of the people had designed. So these are not like someday maybe we'll see this. These are physical objects that have been created. These are actual diagnoses that have been done by machine learning algorithms.
Now, can I do one more thing? Because one question that we always get when this question comes up is, oh my God, Skynet. Right? People just immediately think about the Terminator or the Matrix or some kind of scary superintelligence coming because of these developments. And when Erik and I go talk to the alpha geeks who are making these technologies, they are just dismissive of this possibility. And what they say is, look, we're solving incredibly tough engineering problems. We're throwing a whole lot of math and a whole lot of computation and a whole lot of data at things. That's all we're doing. We don't know how the brain works. We don't know what consciousness is. We're not plumbing those mysteries. We're banging away on this really kind of super important but constrained set of problems over here. I don't think they're lying to us.
You would think that.
That's true. I'm gullible that way. Right.
The hospital information system is not going to suddenly become self-aware and decide to take over.
No.
The line that I use, which I said for the first time in 2013, and it still works, is I will start worrying about that when my computer spontaneously decides to talk to my printer.
Awesome. You have a section when you're talking about this. You're talking about and going back before the computer Skynet not arriving from our toasters, that you talk about the old deal between machines and minds. You're talking about rebalancing, machine to mind, crowd to core, platform to product.
Yeah.
And you talk about the old balance being the machines did all the rote work, all the just like the number crunching and so on, but humans exercised all the judgment.
Yeah.
Is that changing?
It damn well better, right? We're going to do a quick experiment here, and I mean this seriously. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I want you to give yourself a number from 1 to 100. 1 being I'm absolutely abjectly terrible at this. 100 being I'm the best that there could possibly be at this. So here are 3 questions, and just mentally give yourself 3 numbers. Don't shout them out. Compared to the folk around me, I have good judgment. Compared to the folk around me, I make good predictions. Compared to the folk around me, I am a good judge of character. You have 3 numbers in your head? Here's the last bit of the assignment. Average them. Don't have to be 2 decimal points of accuracy, average them. Everybody have a number? Raise your hand if your number is above 50. Way up in the air. Yeah, gang, no more than half the hands should be up in the air. So we're just super fond of our judgment, and there's way too much evidence. Our judgment is awesome, but it is biased and buggy and flawed, and it's really easy to beat our judgment with just a little bit of objective evidence and a little bit of math.
And so you're saying in these domains, some that we think of as being not just about business, but judgment in the legal sense, for instance, that we'd be better off using algorithms to decide who gets parole.
Well, yeah, exactly. There have been studies of this, and there's a fascinating study of Israeli judges, and the main thing that determined whether or not someone got parole or not was not the facts of the case, it was whether or not that judge had had a meal recently. So if the judge had low blood sugar, you were very unlikely to get parole. But if you were lucky enough to go just after breakfast or just after lunch, your odds went way, way up. So these were patterns that showed up repeatedly. It was peer-reviewed, carefully studied, and this has been found in lots of other situations that we are just subject to all sorts of biases in our decision-making. And there's a Nobel Prize. Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky got Nobel Prizes for pointing out these kinds
Not
of...
Tversky, he was dead.
Yeah, that's right. These biases in decision-making that happen, they're like blind spots. We're all familiar with the visual blind spots, but we have the same kind of blind spots in our mental decision-making. And so there's room to use algorithms to make better decisions. And one of the other things that's sweeping, in addition to artificial intelligence, that's sweeping the country and the world is more data-driven decision-making, shifting from using human judgment to more data-driven decisions. And so, for instance, the number of companies that, by our criteria, have become data-driven has increased by about 3-fold over the past 5 years. It's become much more data-driven. And the companies that are data-driven have about 5% better productivity than the companies that aren't data-driven.
The parole, the dysfunctions of the parole decision are so widely accepted now that a lot of states have actually gone toward algorithmic scoring for parole. This notion that I'm going to look into your eyes and know if you're a reformed criminal or not, give me a break. There's just way too much evidence it doesn't work very well.
And again, part of the reason that this didn't happen before was we just didn't have the data. We didn't have the ability of techniques. So, it used to be that for thousands of years, the way important decisions were made in organizations, companies, kingdoms, whatever, is people would sit around, talk, they'd all give their opinions, and then when it was time to make a decision, they would go with the HIPPO. And the HIPPO, anybody heard that acronym before? An acronym we've used in some of our writing. It's an acronym for the highest paid person's opinion. So basically, that's what you ended up using as the decision-making criteria. You went around, and then whoever had the highest pay, their opinion would rule. But that's because you had no other data, no other way of judging. But as Jim Clark once said, if we have data, we're going to go with the data. If all we have is opinions, we'll go with mine.
How many of you have seen a bad decision made based on the highest paid person's opinion?
And we should be clear. Algorithms make have some weird, stupid outcomes too. What Eric and I are not saying is give every decision of any consequence over to the technology and don't ever second guess it. That's a really scary way to proceed.
Yeah. Mez, you said exactly right. These are 3 rebalancings. And while we are enthusiasts for the power of machines, the power of platforms, the power of the crowd, we absolutely are clear in the book that it's not like you turn the dial all the way to max on each of those. You have to understand where the trade-offs are.
There seems to be a recent backlash a bit against algorithmic decision-making. People complaining that the algorithms might be trained on bad data, that they might have their own biases, that we don't know what's in the algorithms, who's controlling them. What do you say about that?
That's absolutely legit, and in particular, if you train an algorithm on a set of data that only has one segment of the population, you're going to not do a very good job with other segments of the population. So no one in machine learning that we talk to is unaware of this problem, and so they work really hard on training these things. There's another complaint which you brought up, which is we don't know what's in the algorithms. Gang, we don't know what's between our ears either. And when we use Danny Kahneman's language in the book about system 1 and system 2, system 1 is this really fast, instinctual, snap judgment thing. System 2 is the slow, deliberative, rational. We all walk around thinking that because we're evolved human beings, system 2 kind of carries the day and it can override this lizard braid system 1. That's actually about 180 degrees backward. And what we know from way too much evidence is that what really happens, the imagery that I love, is that system 2, this rational deliberative thing, is a very high-paid lawyer drafted by system 1 to get system 1's will done out there in the world. So it's an explainer module, not the actual decider module.
People call psychologists call it confabulation. You will come up with a reason for doing something, no matter whether or not you realize it or not, and that's part of what System 2 does. But you do hit on some important points. It is certainly possible and common for these algorithms to have hidden biases in them, and it usually comes not because the people who design the algorithms have some ill intent. It's as Andy said, it's from the training data. And if the training data is trained on, who should we give loans to? Let's look at who our loan officers gave loans to. And if the loan officers had biases, subtle biases, those are going to be picked up in the training data, and the algorithm is going to have those biases. But it could be problematic because it's very unlikely that the algorithm, or it's certain that the algorithm is not going to have a rule in there that says, don't give loans to black people or whatever the biases is. It's going to be much more subtle because many of these neural nets have upwards of 1 billion interconnections and weights, and trying to sort out what exactly is going on in those billion interconnections and weights is basically impossible. They cannot explain it to us. We can't properly explain to each other. The reason that I think Andy and I both have some pushback on a little bit on the anger against the algorithms is that we have the potential to improve them over time, and I think that there's more room to test. And the algorithm will come up with the same recommendation given the same amount of the same data, and then you can tweak it and you can see what kinds of mistakes it may be making. And once you improve it, you can have sustained improvements over time. That's a lot harder to do with humans. It's much harder to even understand where the biases of humans are and get them to overcome their own biases.
For example, if you give an experienced clinician, a medical clinician, the same information about a patient over the space, and you wait about 24 or 48 hours, they will agree with themselves about 65% of the time, no more than that. That's not a failure mode that the algorithms have, but the algorithms are just god-awful stupid about what's happening out there in the world. They deeply lack common sense. We have a ton of that. And what Eric and I are excited about is if you bring together minds and machines properly, you don't double down on the errors. You can cancel each other's errors out.
Yeah. So how do you do that? How would you put mind and machine together in these judgment scenarios?
Let me give you a couple of examples. One is exactly in sort of looking at data diagnoses. A lot of these algorithms, they can be tuned and be very good at detecting cancer, but they often make too many false positives. They say, hey, this looks like cancer, and it really isn't. Humans are actually better at ruling those out. So many of the systems that people put in place will do them sequentially. The machine will bring to the attention, this is something that looks concerning. Instead of these 1,000 places you could look, or these 10,000 places you look, just look at these 20. And then the human focuses their attention on the ones that are concerning, and maybe rules some in and some out. Another example is one that I think we may all be able to relate to a little bit more, is the sales process. Our friend Sebastian Thrun runs a company called Udacity. Anybody here know Udacity? Familiar with that? It's an online teaching course. And they get a lot of incoming traffic from people through chat rooms saying, hey, is this course right? Should I be doing this? What do you think? Should I be taking this? And they have highly trained, really good salespeople who respond back in these chat rooms, rapid fire answering questions. Some of them are better than others. And what Sebastian and his student realized was that, hey, all these transcripts of all of our conversations with customers and potential customers are training data for an algorithm. Let's teach the algorithm which conversations lead to sales and which ones don't lead to sales. And by looking at examples, sales, not sale, sales, not sale, it eventually saw certain patterns or certain kinds of things, information you can provide, ways you can phrase things that are more likely to convert a potential customer. But instead of trying to build an uber amazing bot that would be able to answer all of the questions that people came in that was sort of artificially intelligent at that level, they built one that just gave advice or suggestions to the human salespeople, especially to those not so good, the 50% that were below average. And every organization has 50% of the people that are below average, sadly.
Hard truth.
Another hard truth. So, but what it would do is, as the questions came in, it would notice some patterns and say, you might want to give them this piece of information, or you might want to phrase it this way. And over time, the humans got better, but they would get this prompting, and it increased the throughput by about 50% and the conversion rate by over 20%. So that was a good example of humans and machines working together to have better performance than either of them could have separately.
Okay. Last topic before we open it up to all of you for questions. If the computer is going to be so good at diagnosing disease, at helping us with sales, maybe doing it one day, what are we going to do?
Right? Read science fiction novels.
Thank you.
Write and read science fiction novels. The important thing to keep in mind is that technology is encroaching on stuff that we used to need all of us for. That's absolutely true, and Erik and I think that encroachment is going to continue and it's going to accelerate, and that can be a terrifying vision for a lot of people. The thing to keep in mind is that there is no shortage of work to be done. There is no shortage of work to be done that is, for a long time to come, even with crazy tech progress, still needs to be done by human beings. And a couple different categories of that are work that requires compassion, or work that requires tapping into social drives, work that requires dealing with other human bodies. We're so blobby and weird, the robots are not very good at that stuff yet. My mom, unfortunately, is in a rehab facility. I think she'd want me to specify that it's a physical rehab facility. And the surgeon that worked on her back, and then the physical therapists who are helping her regain her function, these are not going to be replaced by robots anytime soon. I can vouch for that firsthand. We need to take care of little kids. We have sick people. We have lonely elderly people. That is work, that is human work to be done. If we could actually decide that we wanted to have an infrastructure in this country that was better than a D+ grade, the robots are not repairing bridges and airports yet. So that's hard, good old-fashioned, brawny, hard hat work for America. We can continue to go down the list. There's just no shortage of work to be done.
I mean, the thing to keep in mind in terms of the big picture is technology's always been destroying jobs, but it's also always been creating jobs. So there's this turnover. We're concerned because it's happening at a faster pace. It's a broader swath of things, but we're very far from having machines be able to do everything. I don't doubt that maybe someday that will happen, but the problem we're facing right now is not the end of work. It's a big dislocation, a transference of work. And the advice I would give is look for things that machines can't do well. And Andy hit on two of the big categories. One are interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence, caring, compassion, coaching, motivating, teamwork, leadership, all of those sort of human skills. The other big category is creative work. And I mean like large-scale, complicated, writing novels, coming up with scientific discoveries, being an entrepreneur and conceiving of a whole new way of organizing people and products and customers. Those kinds of large-scale creative tasks, machines can't do well at all. In fact, there's probably no better time in history to be a talented entrepreneur or a person with any kind of talent that is scalable with these machines. It's a time when you can just affect the world to a far greater extent than you ever could before. So there's room for ways that we can do a lot better. And I think it's way premature to sort of be talking about let's put everybody on basic income or whatever and give up on work. I think there's so much work that needs to be done and that can be done only by humans. We just have to help make that transition happen.
I mean, you're kind of my exhibit A for someone who's not going to get replaced by technology anytime soon, because I know 3 important things that you do professionally. You write science fiction novels. Computer-generated extended prose, wow, does that suck? Like, it's just completely, it's gibberish so far. You are an amazing moderator, and you're tapping into all these social energies out here in the room. Technology's lousy at that. And Erik and I have learned a ton from you about energy over the years, and you decided to focus on that problem and then inform yourself on it. You picked an area and then got deep on it. The technology doesn't know what area to go pick and get deep on.
Okay. Well, I look forward to reading all of your science fiction novels in the years to come. on that note, let's give it up for Andy and Erik here.
Thanks, Max.
And so now we will take questions. So we'll start over here. Amy.
So your very first topic that you talked about was the how well crowds do compared to experts. And it seems like on the one hand, this is kind of a problematic erosion of the notion of expertise, because if that's the case, then how can we, tell people you should listen to these scientists about global warming, or you should listen to the medical establishment about vaccines? And I don't know if it's just a matter of, something that's just like accumulation of research data versus coming up with different kinds of ideas, but I was hoping you could talk a little more about the distinctions between the kind of issues where you might want crowdsourcing or expertise might not actually be that valuable versus the ones where expertise is helping.
Can I do this one? Because I've tried to think about this. Your question's a really important question. What we don't want to be in the business of is contributing to the erosion of respect for facts and for expertise. There's enough of that going on already, right? So the way I've come to think about it is, if you want to understand the state of the art in climate change or crystallography or anything, go talk to the credentialed experts, and those folk are pretty easy to identify. If you want to make progress on a tough problem in those disciplines, that's where I start to turn to the crowd, and I make a distinction between credentials and chops. And what the crowd demonstrates, what these weirdos out in the crowd demonstrates, they got amazing chops to work on a problem that credentialed experts continue to undervalue, I think.
And this is a really key point. Absolutely, I don't think that expertise is less valuable. It's more valuable. The point is that expertise takes many forms. The people come in and solve these problems. They have amazing insights that the people inside the organization didn't have. They have some expertise in random forest and decision analysis in different techniques than the ones inside the organization have. So what you're really doing is you're tapping into a more diverse set of techniques and expertise. Exactly. You're avoiding the groupthink. And by doing that, that's what you're really leveraging. It's not that these are a bunch of people who have no skills, whatever, and just are throwing darts against a board. These are really, really sharp people who are involved. They have chops. Some of them have credentials. Some of them don't have credentials. But they have skills that obviously the initial group didn't have. So it's not at all meant to be shooting down expertise or learning or techniques. If anything, it's tapping into more of that in a more diverse way.
And the last thing I think it's important to say about that, chops are accessible, right? Can you do this or not? Did your algorithm perform better or not? To me, that's the exact opposite of morons yelling fake news at each other.
Yeah, and there are more and more platforms to find this. So Topcoder, we mentioned that. This is where people can go, and there's a pretty objective ranking there of people who have high Topcoder scores, who have done things. Kaggle, and one of the things that
these folk are not winging it, right?
Yeah. They have, and they learn from each other. So it's a new way of generating expertise, if you will, and identifying.
Okay, thank you. Over here, sir.
You both spoke early on about concentrations of power and awareness, and you did so in terms of individual companies that came close to being monopolies. I mean, I don't know if you use words monopolies, but, and here's where my questions start, isn't the real concentration of power tech itself? The combination of now 4 generations that have worked on algorithms, hardware, communications, and most people would easily move from one problem to another, and that it has become quite an upper class, and with a need to defend itself and to keep on growing, and that might be happening now is a move from augmentation technologies to scale automation, to autonomous driving. Who has asked for that besides the tech companies?
Disabled people?
Well,
let me finish, since you asked, that was a question.
Yeah.
Disabled people, blind people, elderly people, people with small kids who'd like to have them get around safely.
I'm in too.
People who want to have fewer than 30,000 road fatalities in the United States per year. I'm asking for that.
I mean, that's on the margin at that point in terms of autonomous driving.
On the margin?
And in terms of scale automation, I mean, so the Lieutenant Governor of California has actually just broached this as a problem for the tech industry. So my question is, if you'll have another book out in 3 or 4 years, will there have been serious attacks from the left and the right on the tech industry for just the reasons that I've outlined?
I think there will be a tax, but not for the reasons that you want. I'm with Andy that I think self-driving cars would be one of the most most humanitarian things that could be done. Given, I think people will consider that the carnage that we are willing to accept right now with non-self-driving cars is just unimaginable in a few years, and it would be striking that we didn't try to work on it sooner. That said, I do see a concern, and it's one that I think the tech industry, all of society is going to have to take on, which is not just the concentration of power in companies, but potentially much more concentration of wealth among individuals. Because some of these winners, there's a great time to be an entrepreneur. There's more millionaires, more billionaires than ever in history. The top 1% and the top 1% of the top 1% have a bigger share of income than any time since just before the Great Depression in the 1930s, if that's any comfort. And that kind of concentration of wealth can lead to a concentration of power, and the people who aren't part of that, I could see becoming very disaffected. So one of the challenges we have before us is thinking about how we can create not just prosperity, but shared prosperity. I think technology is doing a lot to make the pie bigger, and it's up to us as a society to think about, as we make that pie bigger, what can we do to make sure that it's broadly shared?
Okay. Thank you, sir. Over here.
If I may have a question, actually, I think that ties in with that. As we make the pie bigger, you closed with, what can people do? We can be compassionate toward kids, just like early childhood teachers. We can be working with kids, being teachers. We can care for the elderly. I thoroughly agree with you on that. I'm getting a little emotional because these are the same industries that are not getting paid. They are getting driven out, and I'm not in any way attacking you guys in any way, but our system is not designed to do that. I have talked to many people. I'm a teacher myself. I've had a student in particular say, I was explicitly told junior year, don't go become a teacher. You're too good for this. And yet to me, that's exactly the people that we need to become teachers, but they can't make a living given the way that things have changed because of this inequality gap. What can we do?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with that little last part that you said. I'm not sure it's because of a big gap in wealth and income that we don't pay teachers very well. I just don't make that association. That
is fair.
Okay.
I would agree. It's systemically, and there's institutions, but because of the rules we set up, this is a systems problem. This is the institutions. These are the rules that we've put in place. What should we change to make them valued for the way that they should be valued because of what they do? Because I agree, those are the kinds of things that we do really well as humans, but that's not valued economically because it doesn't go faster, faster, faster.
But this is a choice, okay? This is not something that is determined exogenally. We've been visiting a lot of people. I was in Finland recently, and they choose to have teachers among the highest paid college graduates.
Yes.
But that's not something that a computer decided. That's something that a society decides. So this is a conversation we have to have. If we think that lawyers are going to add more value or more of the wealth creators than teachers and pay them accordingly as a society, then that's one allocation. Or we can decide that teachers are creating more value. There's a great study by Erik Brynjolfsson that a teacher in the top quartile adds about $400,000 to the earnings of each year of students that come out of that compared to a median teacher. So even just on that very narrow metric, which is not the only metric of earnings, it's a huge amount of wealth creation. But that's something, that is a choice. And one of the lessons we had at the end of the second machine age, the last book, and this book as well, is that technology does not make our choices for us. We can't abdicate that or blame technology for that.
Right.
We can make our choices. What technology is doing is giving us more powerful tools than we've ever had in history. And tools can be used in lots of different ways. That means the more powerful the tool is, the more choices we have, the more power we have, almost by definition, to change the world. Now, are we going to use that? Are we going to use it? And we have to decide what our values are. I think that those of us that are in this conversation right now, I probably have fairly aligned values, but it has to be a conversation broader than that about how we want to allocate our society's resources and what kind of level of shared prosperity. But we see technology as part of the solution to that. It can have safer roads, it can have better health, it can have better education. How we go about rewarding the participants in that is a social decision.
And the only thing I want to add to that, a technologically sophisticated society is a wealthy enough society to pay teachers well. But paying teachers well is not about the technology, about the choices that we are making as a people together.
So thank you. Great question. So we choose. You, sir.
Early on, you talked about price gouging and the power concentrated in various companies, a few companies. And how do you get better than zero? Yeah, how do you get cheaper than zero? What if you put a monetary value on privacy or lack of privacy? How would that enter in your thinking about when to worry?
There are about 1.9 billion Facebook accounts in the world today. That is what? That's about 2/7 of the world's population. So either Facebook is the first company in history that has finally managed to fool all of the people all of the time, or there's something else going on. And that other thing that I think is going on is we're going to roll out a suite of really, really attractive capabilities to you to let you form a network of friends and share all kinds of media and do these other things. And in exchange, you got to look at some ads. 2 billion people are taking that deal. I see that, and I have to have some faith in the choices that they're making. There has been intense scrutiny on these companies to see if they're doing really nefarious, shady things and selling our data out the back door. I haven't seen the expose about how terrible things are. I just don't share that concern.
You're saying it's a quid pro quo and people just value that privacy less than what they're getting out of this.
It's a voluntary exchange.
And as economists, we're kind of, as a bedrock thing, we're kind of fans of voluntary exchange, especially when you have the information about the exchange. And I think we do have the information about that exchange.
Okay.
I think it's a good deal, actually. I think it's a really good deal. Just take that one little part of what Facebook does or Instagram. Photographs used to be about 50 cents a piece. It wasn't that long ago, the year 2000, and there were, there were about 1/20th as many photos taken back then as there are today and shared. And now they're done basically for free. We share them with our mothers or grandmothers or kids instantly through this network. It's a much better, for me, social system way of sharing photographs than what we had, 15 years ago.
My wife keeps getting ads for guns. She doesn't know what she clicked on someday that caused that to happen or how to stop it.
Well, the user interface could be better. There is something in Facebook where you can go up and you can, through the preferences, and I don't have the menu in front of me, you can click through and you can actually click things you'd like to see more of or less of. You can see your history. So there is a way you could do it. They could do a better job of making it more accessible.
Thank you.
Or
Thank you, sir.
Find a 12-year-old.
That's a growth industry right there.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, over here.
Just as a point, by the way, to the prior person's message, you guys said earlier that Google, Facebook, they're not monopolies because they're not charging you, but they are monopolies in that if people are on those two platforms, they're charging the advertisers. So,
monopoly means takes all of a market.
I understand.
But let's be careful about the words we're using then.
What's your question, sir?
The question I've got is NPR was just doing something on this just the other day, and they were doing a thought experiment on growth. And they were saying that imagine that you go to sleep every 50 years from 1800 to today. Mm-hmm. And every year you wake up and you've got 1900s electrification, and you've got cars, 1950s has come through, you've got the washing machines and whatnot. And then if you went to sleep and wake up today, essentially nothing has changed other than the electronics. And then they paired that with the Bureau of Labor and Statistics growth rates, which are showing that the growth rate from 2007 to 2016 for productivity is the lowest growth rate that we have ever seen since this has been keeping track of. So if what you're saying is true and happening, why is the per person labor productivity growth lower than we have ever seen in the history of this record keeping?
Yeah, there are a couple of really interesting questions down in there. So let me say two things. I'm going to kick the productivity question over to Erik because he's one of the great scholars of productivity, actually. That thought experiment, waking up every 50 years, is a really interesting one. If you picked a random human being on the planet and didn't confine yourself to those of us lucky enough to be born into the luck, to win the birth lottery, be born in America, you'd get an extremely different result. The average human being would have seen no change from 1800 till about 30 or 40 years ago, and then the material conditions of their life would have improved faster than ever before. I'm talking about income, I'm talking about health, child mortality, things we care very deeply about. The past 50 years have been the most optimistic and hopeful time for the average person on the planet that we've seen. So if we broaden out that experiment, we get a very different result.
And they've set it to the point of technological change, not when the change reaches people.
So one thing to bear in mind is that GDP is not a measure of our well-being, and productivity is based entirely on GDP. I know that it's always used that way. It's used that way on NPR. It's used that way in the newspapers. People get excited when the quarterly numbers come out and productivity was 2.3% or was it 2.2%. The person who invented GDP was a guy named Simon Kuznets, one of the great inventions of the 20th century. And shortly after he invented it, he said, please, please do not use this as a measure of our well-being. And that's what we instantly started doing. It is a measure of production, of things that are bought and sold, of purchased in the economy. All this free stuff we've been talking about, by definition, was never intended to be in GDP. It's not part of GDP.
Sorry, I'm not speaking to GDP. I'm talking about per worker, per person labor efficiency.
Yeah, well, what's the numerator? So that is, productivity is defined as output per worker. How is output defined? Output is defined as GDP. Go look it up.
Okay.
That's what it is. So that's what it is. So we're not all, the health, the well-being, the improvements in living standards, that those are not counted as part of this. The other thing to bear in mind is that I think I actually, to be frank, I was a little disappointed with the productivity numbers recently, and we're sort of in this still had a very long slump of the Great Recession there. The examples that we're talking about, I think most of them, part of our excitement is that these haven't even hit yet. So we were just talking about self-driving cars. How many self-driving cars are there driving around Seattle right now? Basically zero, okay? So this is something that we can see coming in the pipeline. On a lot of the other, the medical examples, yes, they were done in the laboratory, but they're not helping us right now. So our enthusiasm and our excitement, and part of the disconnect, I think, between the technophiles, the folks in Silicon Valley and at Amazon, and some of the people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is the BLS is looking mainly in a rearview mirror and saying, hey, this is what happened previously, and we're looking forward, and we see just breathtaking excitement. I think if you look at the scale of inventions every 50 years, the 50-year period where you get artificial intelligence, where you get machines that can think,
where you interconnect humanity for the first time ever,
and you have a billion people, I think it would be very hard to say that wasn't the coolest 50-year period ever in history.
And to do one more tick of that experiment, how many of us think that if we fell asleep today for a Rip Van Winkle period and woke up in 50 years, we would not be blown away by the crazy sci-fi world that we see around us? Like so that thought experiment. Really?
So wow. When we see these things pipe, and we'll see, we should talk again in 50 years, maybe a little sooner. And so maybe we're wrong. Maybe there will be a catastrophe that stops this. But what we already see that has been proven, we've ridden around in those self-driving cars. We've talked to the guys who developed them. So these are not hypothetical, and these are not just science fiction, although they're that too. These are things that exist, and as they diffuse, and as those not just the 1.9 billion people on Facebook. How many people have smartphones? A few billion, more than that.
3, 4.
As they all get access to a doctor that can diagnose them for zero cost with efficiency as good as the average doctor, maybe better than that. I think that those things are totally in the pipeline, totally happening, and that's part of our excitement. But I think you're right. These things haven't hit yet, and the pure productivity part of it hasn't been as evident as what we expect to see going forward.
That's fair enough. I just find it interesting that we see the huge productivity growth of Microsoft and the personal computing revolution, and then the entire cloud computing, entire machine learning, everything, we see no change whatsoever.
So Erik, I just want to hit on this point that you make about GDP. What you've said, and you wrote it really eloquently in Second Machine Age, that if you take something that used to be really expensive, like GPS used to cost $500 for Garmin, and now it's free in all of our cell phones, or if self-driving cars make transportation cost half of what it does, it looks like a lowering of GDP or no change.
That's right.
Even though we've gotten this new value.
Yeah, this is just, it's a sad fact about GDP. You think that GDP is supposed to be, but let's take a really specific example. Wikipedia, we were just talking about that, replaces Encyclopedia Britannica. Wikipedia is free. How much does it contribute to GDP? Zero. Okay, tiny bit for the electricity that it takes to run the servers, but basically let's call that zero, okay? Whereas Encyclopedia for each person, but contributed a significant amount. But it's a total night and day. All those apps you have on your smartphone, not just the camera, the video camera, the GPS, everything, those would have cost thousands of dollars, and they did cost thousands of dollars when they were separate a la carte items. If the BEA, it's not the BLS, but the BEA does the GDP part of it, had tried to properly account for the extra value, you would have an explosion on the production side as well. But it's a very thorny problem, and what happens is that it just gets completely missed.
Louis C.K., the comedian, has a great summary of what Erik just said. He's like, everything's amazing and nobody's happy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm going to get off the stage. If that was truly happening,
can we move on?
Yeah, we're moving on.
You would expect that worker that's got instant access to the information should be more productive in whatever he is producing.
Thank you, sir.
No.
Yeah.
Over here.
Let me just answer that last bit.
Erik, let's move on.
Because I just got to answer this last point.
No, you don't.
Yes, I do.
You don't have to.
I have to. No, you don't understand.
Let
I
her
have
do
to.
it.
3 books later, this is how it goes.
Because the productivity you get ultimately is what the benefits you get as a consumer, not at what you're doing as a worker. And so it's a mistake to think that by producing more stuff, that automatically increases productivity. It's what you actually end up getting as a benefit. And so the extent that this creates benefits for you as an end user, that's the end. That's the productivity. It doesn't have to make you better as a worker. Right.
Over here.
That was a good addition.
Quickly, we just have time for the people in line.
All right,
Okay.
we'll go really quick. And
The
we'll
line
not
is
answer the person
closed.
Sorry,
3 times.
we'll lightning round it.
Yeah.
And then we sign books.
So
And then you all
computers
buy books. Sorry. Go on, please.
Machine learning AI computers right now are extremely good at logic, like Boolean stuff, or perception, minimizing some loss function. Between those two things, humans do concept formations. Currently, machines don't. People you talk to, when do you foresee this kind of concept formation gap closing? And then, to me, that's like what opens the floodgates to AI.
We don't know. You're absolutely right. It's great at some of those perception tasks, and those are really important. That is far from everything. One of the reasons we think that there's still a lot of work to be done is that there's all those other things that machines don't do well. There are super smart people, more than ever in history, working to solve those. We ask them. They don't know when they'll make that discovery, but they're working on it.
I will say in the book they have excellent examples of machines doing what we would think of as creativity and doing it well. Over here, sorry.
Earlier, we talked about DeepMind's AlphaGo, and when it came online, it went and destroyed all existing human masters.
Well, it didn't destroy them. The first one was 4-1, but yeah, it was. Yeah, now it's.
When they turned it on online in anonymous, master.
Oh yeah, more
then
recently.
it destroyed
That's
42
right.
in a row. Then
That's
it
right.
just destroyed the current master.
Yes.
And then so then DeepMind did 100 self-playing games, and then they turned it off. And they don't have any plans to turn it back on. So my question is, do you feel like the mere existence of an algorithm or a bot like AlphaGo reduces human dignity in terms of our endeavors in that area?
Not one iota. Not one little bit. You know how what happened to the sales of Go boards in Korea after Lee Sedol lost that match? Yeah. They skyrocketed. Lee Sedol became a better Go player as a result of playing against AlphaGo. I fundamentally don't understand this notion that we humans have to define ourselves by what we're best in the universe at. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
The best thing that ever happened to Gary Kasparov was losing to Deep Blue.
It took him a while to hit that realization. If you know Gary does not like to lose. But this notion that our dignity is compromised if we lose to a machine in a game, I'm sorry, I don't share that view in the slightest.
Well, what if it proves that the game is pointless? So my son likes to play me tic-tac-toe, but I mean, if I emphasize the point to him, this game is pointless, your endeavor is basically.
I would lay off on the existentialism with a young child as a general rule.
But I think over time we have to think about what is our place in the universe and how do we evaluate that. And I think lots of people get enjoyment about playing games with each other. I know that I can't outrun a race car, but I still had fun doing races with my kids, and I still like watching the Olympics with humans racing against other humans. So I think it's more complicated, more subtle than just saying, once the machine can do it, it's no longer interesting.
Right.
It's manifestly not true that, because we do still find this interesting. But there's layers upon layers of what are our ultimate motivations, and maybe that would be a good project for us to.
But when things
work
do
on
get
next.
solved, it does change the equation, because like I no longer play chess. I used to be first board.
That changes the equation
Yeah.
for you. It did not.
Yes,
So let me finish. It
some
did not.
subset
It did
of
not change
humanity.
the equation for a bigger subset of people who went out and bought Go boards. I just. You're one individual. Other
never
people
pl-
made
I
very
don't play
different
any more
choices.
poker.
You should take up Go, but we got to move on for the sake
And
of
the other
time
thing
here.
is there are a lot of other things that machines can't still beat you at. So I think there's no shortage of things for you to work on.
Over here, sir.
Thank you. You've highlighted and drawn attention to some of the bright prospects for this technology, and it's really encouraging to hear you being very exciting about it. And I think you're hearing in the room tonight some concerns that folks share. What advice would you give to policymakers and/or lawmakers to, on the one hand, encourage, facilitate, or at least not screw up the benefits?
The bar gets lowered these days, doesn't it?
I
Not screw up
understand.
really badly, not screw up disastrously badly.
Right. And yet, on the other hand, to ameliorate or mitigate some of the downsides.
Our colleague Alan Blinder is a really, really good economist, and his most enduring contribution might be a thing called Blinder's Law, which is really depressing. And what he noticed, he worked in Washington for a long time, is that the areas where there is the greatest consensus among economists and professional policy people are the areas where they get listened to the least. And the least actually happens. So the policy playbook, the smart policy playbook, is really uncontroversial these days. And to remember it, I just hum the old McDonald theme song to myself. And when I get to EIEIO, I go entrepreneurship, immigration, education, infrastructure, and original research. EIEIO. We're doing a middling to actively lousy job at all of those things right now, and it's getting worse instead of better. The administration today just announced that it was going to walk away from the very notion of a startup visa. Great, that's a move our enemies would make. So Eric and I have written lots of policy articles. The policy playbook is not just some brave intellectual new territory. It's the fact that it's just not being done.
We've been super optimistic about the technology. We're very, very concerned on the policy side. We share your concern. One of the reasons we wrote the book, one of the reasons we're having this conversation, is hopefully change the national conversation so we can make some progress on those parts. But you're right to be concerned, and we are too.
The answer I heard was that you should run for office, sir.
I should which, sorry?
That you should run for office.
I should.
That's what I heard.
Exactly.
We'll vote for you.
Well,
It sounds like you're going to listen to policy wonks. Adam,
Bit of an axe to grind.
rising tone.
I'm an intellectual property attorney.
Rising tone.
And I used to think that inventions were one of those things that were going to survive. And then NPR talked about, there was a juke deck, which is machine-created music, which people are now licensing machine-created music because humans are too expensive to license music from. And 3 recent articles just came out about human-assisted invention processes. So artificial intelligence being used to assist people in inventing things. Copyrights and patents are enshrined in our Constitution as a way to encourage people to invent and create. How soon before we have to remove them, copyrights and patents, because machines are doing a better job at creating, and there's no point in rewarding the small human contribution left? That's my rising intonation.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Adam.
I think it's a long, long time. I mean, there's no question that machines are helping with invention. They've helped from the beginning, right? I mean, whether it's a microscope or whatever, there have been tools that have helped people discover and invent things, and they're becoming much more powerful. But machines, until we make those conceptual breakthroughs that the earlier questioner asked about, and we, I don't know when that's going to happen. It could be 100 years, it could be 5 years. Probably it's going to be more than that. Machines aren't good at this sort of more unstructured, long-term, complicated planning. They're great at filling out, you give them a very specified task, a very set of examples of these are dogs and these are cats, please distinguish them. But conceiving of the problem is the hardest part. There's a quote we have in the book from Pablo Picasso. Believe it or not, he was an early thinker on this, and he said, computers are useless. All they do is give you answers. And there's it's funny, but he was ahead of his time. There's a lot of truth to that the real value is going to be in conceiving of the problem, defining it, and specifying it well enough that then maybe a machine can go and work through it.
So we'll still ask the questions. And last question to you, sir.
Thank you
No pressure. It needs to be a bang-up final question, however.
Don't disappoint.
42.
Thank you all for speaking. First of all, I appreciate that.
Thanks.
But I'm 26, so I definitely can see a lot of the previous things you're talking about. I've spent way too many hours on Wikipedia and gotten a lot of joy out of that, so I can totally buy your technology thesis. But what I've also seen over my lifetime is what you mentioned, the increasing intensification of terrible policy mistakes. The right one's not getting carried out. And so I just wanted to know what gives you optimism that the positive trend of technology is enough to overcome, again, what I've seen of the last, since I'm becoming more and more of an adult, is more tragic policy mistakes that we keep making.
We've seen this movie before, unfortunately. There have been previous periods in our nation's history where we made decisions that I would violently disagree with. So, things go in cycles, and we should take some comfort from that. My optimism comes from the fact that technological progress, the old joke is it's the only free lunch economists believe in, it is letting us create a more, whatever word you want, abundant, prosperous, wealthy world. While it's doing that, it is letting us tread more lightly on the planet overall, with the huge exception that we're cooking the planet, we need to stop. We need to stipulate that over and over again. Tech progress will help us with that. Maybe not quickly enough, it'll help us with that. So tech progress is giving us giving us human beings more wealth, more prosperity, and letting us take better care of the planet. Now, the pessimism is exactly what you bring up. We might fumble that future. We could do some really stupid things. And a couple of the recent election results make me a little nervous. However, for inspiration, as always, I turn to France. They just elected a 39-year-old guy. This is a really ossified political system. They just elected a 39-year-old guy who says, gang, we're going into the future. We're going to be an entrepreneurial state. All you machine learning geeks, get over here and help us with this. And I find that awesome, right? So there's hope out there. I just wish it was a little closer to home.
I would distinguish between two kinds of optimism. There's the unconditional optimism of a child, before Christmas, expecting the presents to come, and it's like, I can't wait till it happens, and you just sit there and it happens. And I think way too many people who call themselves optimists are those kind of unconditional optimists. Or for that matter, you get some unconditional pessimists, they just know it's going to be terrible. I think they both make the same mistake. They both think that something's going to happen to us. I think the right kind of optimism is conditional optimism. And that's the optimism of the kid who's like, hey, it would be cool if I had a tree house. And if I got some hammers and some nails, maybe got some of the kids in the neighborhood, maybe got my dad to help me, we could go and build a tree house. And then we would have a tree house. And that's the kind of optimism that we need in America, is a kind of a can-do optimism that says we've got more powerful tools, we can change the world, but it's not going to happen automatically. And we're hoping that more people will appreciate this potential, but I'm very, very concerned. It's certainly not going to be automatic. It's going to depend on people like you, and I'm glad you're here and asking those kinds of questions, and not just to us, I mean asking them more fundamentally about what we can do in the world. If we make the right choices, we can have a much better world, and it's something we've done as a society time and time again historically, so there's a track record there. But the thing that I would probably want to leave us, the last word, is just that this is not automatic. We have to be actively engaged in it. The tools are there, but it's not going to happen without our efforts.
The best way to predict the future is to create it.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for coming out on a beautiful June night.
Thank you all. Nez, thank you.